My name is Dr. Alla Baksh. I've been better known as Dr. Abbas among many. I'm a senior lecturer at the School of Languages, Literacies and Translation, Universiti Sains Malaysia. My role here in this webinar is as a moderator. The main objective of this webinar is actually to contribute to the ongoing discussions into assessment and the new normal. I would now like to ask the participants, if you have any questions, please post your questions in the chat box, as there will be a Q&A session at the end of this session. I would now like to introduce you to the first speaker for today, that is Dr. Wahid Aryadust from the National Institute of Education, Singapore.
In this presentation, I'm going to talk about assessment online. Actually, we developed a kind of online assessment system of reading for diagnostic purposes, and we learned quite a little bit about how diagnostic assessment, especially the online form of it, would work. So in this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the process of developing this online assessment, but in brief, actually, there is a lot of details here. What I'm going to present is only one part of this assessment, and I hope that you will find what we have learned from this experiment, longitudinal experiment, I should say, helpful and useful. So let me see, how do I move to the next slide? It seems okay. This slide is one of my favorite slides, to be honest, and I always include it in many presentations that I have, and it's just to stress the significance of these three concepts in language assessment. Starting from the bottom, we have theory or theoretical frameworks, and then we get to the construct and tests. Tests are the instruments that we can see that can be administered via papers or via computers or other technologies, after administration of which we generate test scores. Test scores represent students' abilities. But actually, what every test measures is a construct which we cannot immediately see. In other words, it's not visible. And the construct itself is developed based on a theory or a theoretical framework. Now, I know a lot of scholars would like to think about theories and constructs as synonymous, but I think there are people like Charles Alderson who differentiate between these two concepts. So I follow the same kind of convention. A theory is a body of knowledge that tries to explain, describe, and predict a phenomenon. It actually also describes the kind of components that give rise to that particular phenomenon and how they coalesce and collaborate together to create the phenomenon. A construct is a more specific representation or specification of a theoretical framework within a context. So when we are talking about a construct, we're basically talking about the measurement of a latent trait or latent attributes, if you will. So the concept of measurement, in other words, is something which is implied when we use the term construct. The test is the realization of the construct. Now, I explain this further as I move to the next slides. As late as at least 1989, or even before that, people like Samuel Messick have stressed that the process of developing a psychological test or language assessment test in our field has two stages. Stage one is the construct delineation or construct definition, and stage two is the operationalization or the process of realizing the construct or the components that we want to measure. Now, we need to take into consideration the fact that this construct definition and operationalization vary from test to test. Although theoretical frameworks might still be the same, if you want to extract a construct definition from a theoretical framework, for example, of reading, and if your target population is secondary school students, for example, in Singapore versus Malaysia, I think you're going to come up with two different constructs. And this is primarily because you need to take into consideration the differences of those two populations for which you're going to develop the test. So here is another way that I have presented the same concept which I mentioned before, and I also have this great quotation from Charles Allison's Assessing Reading book. He says, our score is generalizable to the extent it reflects theory and the extent to which that theory is correct. Therefore, to test scores would be correct to the extent that our theoretical frameworks are correct. Of course, it also depends on how we operationalize the construct into tests. There's one more point before I move ahead that I would like to stress here, is that scores are generated for a purpose. We usually make decisions based on test scores. Now, sometimes these decisions are high stakes. Sometimes they are mid stakes or low stakes. Now, some scholars like Michael Caine or Samuel Messick consider the process of decision making a part of test validation, and they refer to it by different names like consequential validity or criterion reference evidence of validity, or as Mike Caine uses the other terminologies like utilization and the extrapolation inference. Well, so they believe that decision making is a part of validation process. But on the other hand, scholars like Danny Borsblum do not think that decision making should be a part of the process of test development. But what I would like to stress here, I'm not trying to say which side or which camp is correct here, because it has been a debate that is ongoing. What I'm trying to say is, yes, we use scores for decisions, so we'd better have evidence to support the decisions that we make. This fact might not be very explicit when it comes to the diagnostic assessment of language skills, because they're usually formative, and you try to provide some kind of information to the test taker about the abilities and about what they can do and they cannot do. In other contexts, like proficiency testing, decision making becomes a lot more significant and prominent. That was the point that I wanted to stress here. And so I've been talking about theory and theoretical frameworks and the importance of theory and theoretical frameworks. The theoretical framework that we employed for the development of our online assessment system is the construction integration model of comprehension. We chose this for a variety of reasons, one of which is, well, actually is reputation. It's one of the most, perhaps the most influential theory of reading comprehension. It has been developed for L1, but it has been actually used and cited quite heavily and highly in L2 language assessment research. So I would like to spend some time here to explain what the construction integration model is and why we actually chose this over other available models. Finch proposed this model in which he suggested that the process of comprehension is constitutes three stages. So stage one is where you develop a surface level in which you develop and register the memory of exact actual words in your working memory. Then following that, so here comprehension has not really taken place because you still do not have a very clear idea about what the text is about. The second stage is the development of a text-based level. A text-based level is actually like sentence level and clause level and also discourse level. It's a mental representation. It's primarily semantic, a semantic representation of the ideas that you read from the text. It's crude. It's in the sense that it's not being processed because there are still gaps between all those idea units that you have processed and comprehended. So you have separate islands of ideas and propositions. Some of them might actually be in the form of visual imagery. Some others might be, in other forms, kind of abstract forms. But these constitute your understanding or your comprehension of macro and microstructure of the passage, plus a lot of gaps. You don't fill the gaps until you start the last part of the comprehension, where you generate this mental representation, this coherent, cogent, and comprehensive mental representation of the passage, which is known as the situation model. Therefore, the situation model is your own background knowledge and information plus the text base that you generated in the previous stage. And the generation of the situation model depends on an array of factors, one of which being perhaps the most important factor of which being the goals. The goals, for example, the goals of reading. For example, the task demands that you should identify the attitude of the reader by reading this passage. So the kind of situation model that you would generate as a result of the demand of the task would be probably different from the kind of situation model that we generate in other situations. So the ultimate goal of comprehension is the generation of a situation model, that cogent and coherent mental representation from the passage, which includes not only the passage, but also your background information and world knowledge. So this is one of the important learning lessons that one of the important lessons that we can learn from the construction integration model of comprehension. A little bit more about Walter Kinch's view of comprehension. So Kinch looks at comprehension as a paradigm for cognition. And when we look at cognition, we can see that there is a spectrum in which you transit from perception, which is the rudimentary or the basic type of cognition, which is probably common between us and other animals, our closest cousins like chimpanzees, and even other animals which are not apes, to analytic thinking, which seems to be specific to Homo sapiens or humans, if you will. So analytic thoughts include problem solving. Now, the takeaway from this part of construction integration model is that we want to engage students in active, effortful, analytical thinking when we are developing a test of reading comprehension. We don't just want to, engage them in some kind of passive, automatic sort of perception. That doesn't count as deep comprehension. So let's keep this in mind: active, effortful, analytical thinking, and move on to a quotation from Kinch. And I think this is very helpful for all of us because it probably just wraps up everything that I have told before quite elegantly. So Kinch proposes that in instruction, and I've also included assessments, it doesn't really matter, it's usually the situation model that the student forms from reading a text that is of interest. The teacher does not care whether the student can recite the text, that's the memory of students, but whether the student understood it correctly and for future use was able to integrate the textual information with whatever background knowledge there was. I think it very eloquently describes everything that I have mentioned earlier. Now, our project, we basically adopted this model. The project aimed to develop a diagnostic system, as I mentioned before, a computerized or online diagnostic system. And this system was basically originally named Cognitive Diagnostic Assessment System. And I think I need to stop here for a little while and provide some information about cognitive diagnostic assessment. Not too much really at the interest of time. So cognitive diagnostic models are kind of advanced, sophisticated psychometric or statistical models, which in one word, or put simply, allow you to break down the ability of, for example, of reading or listening into several components or several sub-skills, if you will, and then provide information of mastery versus non-mastery to every student. For example, you can tell your student whether they have mastered sub-skill A versus sub-skill B and sub-skill C. So that sounds very cool because for a long time there has been this claim that cognitive diagnostic assessment actually conflates psychology and psychometrics. That's really cool. That's what we wanted, because you need to develop a Coh-Metrix, and then define the relationship between items and subskills and so on and so forth. So we started off trying to develop a cognitive diagnostic system. And we also had a plan B just in case that multidimensional representation of language would fail. What are you going to do? Well, our plan B was simply to use a Rasch model, one of the few models in the family of Rasch measurement. We realized that CDM or cognitive diagnostic model didn't work for us for a variety of reasons. Number one was we would have difficulty conveying that information to students, and that was the most important thing. Apart from the technicalities, I think we wouldn't have issues with technicalities of the analysis, but then we were thinking about our main stakeholders. That was the group of students who were going to take the test. How would we, explain that they had the meaning of you have mastered the ability to understand surface information, or the ability to make inferences. You have mastered it, you haven't mastered it. And honestly, it's not very straightforward and very clear-cut. So we decided we would go with a simpler way of doing things. In consultation with teachers from schools, we thought the technical model the analytical model we were going to use was the Rasch measurement. Now, that's just the background about the cognitive diagnostic assessment system. So it actually became basically a diagnostic assessment system online. But I still like the acronym CODIAS. It reads cool, and I still like that. Now, this system is quite extensive. If you think about the scope of the project, looking back in retrospect, I see, gosh, we have done a lot of work in this project because we developed a pretest followed by individualized different treatments for differentiated learning and feedback associated with each of those treatments, followed by a post-test. And we really spent a lot of time in it. It needed a lot of investment. But ultimately, it turned out to be a successful project. What I'm going to do in this webinar is just to zoom in onto the pretest and the kind of feedback that we actually developed, because it's really extensive and we would need a lot of time. So if you want to talk about the whole project, I think that will take quite a few webinars. So let's zoom in onto the pretest and see what kind of tests we developed and how useful it was and what kind of issues we encountered because it was an online system. Okay, first of all, participants. We had a relatively large group of participants, depending on how you interpret the word large. Our sample included 359 secondary 2 and secondary 3 students from Singapore. And the first language of these guys who took the test is actually English. They speak a very good English, wonderful writing skills, wonderful reading and listening skills. It's great. So it's not really, it's different from the context of ESL or EFL kind of assessment. And that's another challenge that we encountered here, because most of the literature in language assessment revolves around the idea of ESL and EFL testing, whereas the context where I'm, researching and teaching and living actually is not an EFL or ESL context. So we first piloted the first version of the test to around 70 students, 68 to be more precise, students. And then we learned a few things, including the fact that we were probably quite ambitious in our first attempt, because the first test included four texts. They were pretty long, so we decided to do away with one of the texts, the last one, because the students didn't find time to answer the questions. So after tweaking and sharpening our assessment following this piloting stage, which I always also recommend that we should include one piloting stage in our assessment, we moved to the main study. It included 2 sessions, actually took 2 full days. During the first day, 117 students from secondary 2 and 3 took the test. On the second day, session 2, 167 students took the test. Now, procedures actually there is a little bit of details in procedures, but I have chosen these. I think they are most pertinent to the current webinar. We had a lot of meetings, actually, starting from grant writing all the way to designing the test and administering the test to test takers and especially speaking with and collaborating with two online service providers. There were two companies that provide computer technologies to educational systems, educational projects. We had quite a lot of meetings. That's one of the things that we should consider if we want to do this kind of project in the future. We must be prepared mentally for a lot of meetings. Through these meetings, then we also talked about the sort of text we wanted to measure, and the text that we wanted to give to the students, based on which we wanted to measure the ability of the test takers. So we used some texts, actually quite a lot of texts, in some workshops with three wonderful teachers who helped us choose the most appropriate texts and create test items for the students. So just to give you an idea about the extensiveness of the corpus that we had created, with the help of a research assistant, we chose, it took quite a little bit of time, but we chose 1,000 texts which were potentially useful or pertinent to the level of secondary 2 and 3 students in Singapore. Then we narrowed it down through some Cometrics analysis and linguistic analysis and the linguistic and complexity analysis of the text. We also took into consideration the type of text, especially the genre, because we knew that in Singapore, a variety of texts are read by students, so we had to take that into consideration. This brings me to the previous point of the differentiation between the construct and the theory, because here we were trying to formulate our construct when we needed to take into consideration the realities of the ground and what kind of text students should read and what kind of text would be more useful for our main stakeholders, who are the test takers in the project. So we chose a large number of texts, 3 of which went into our pretest, and quite a large number of them became the treatments, and three more became the post-test. The kind of items that we developed for all of the treatments in pre and post-test were actually either multiple choice questions or drag and drop. Multiple choice questions, because there is some research that shows that MCQs are typically easier. That means that there is not a huge test effect factor when it comes to multiple choice questions. But we didn't want to make things complicated by including, for example, open-ended questions where students had to write a paragraph or even a sentence. Even though we were using some computer-based technologies, I think it would have been quite difficult and challenging for us to develop an algorithm to read students' answers and score them. So it would fall into the realm of writing. I think that's something that Atta is going to talk about later. So what else did we do? Like I said, we used Cometrics analysis in order to look into the linguistic features, but we didn't put all the eggs into the basket of Cometrics and linguistic features of the passages. We got a lot of wonderful ideas from the teachers who would tell us, for example, this kind of text might not be very much accessible or engaging for the students because of this and that reason. They were very experienced, and their experience helped us a lot. So there are different Cometrics applications available. This is the Text Usability Assessor, which I recommend to teachers always. It provides you with 5 indices like syntactic simplicity, narrativity, deep cohesion, and so on. And it's very easy to make sense of. You can use this for your usual teaching as well, and that's the website of Cometrics. And here is the actual Cometrics itself. And we also benefited from this book written by Danielle McNamara and her team. So following all these, one of the outputs of the previous processes was the generation of the pretest. The pretest included 3 texts, as you see, 3 passages. You can see the titles on the left-hand side. The positives and negatives of using social networking sites. The second one was poverty, poaching, and death. And the third one was deep intellect. They're really engaging. I personally loved when I read them, and it was not just my personal idea. Later on, we collect the data that we collected from the students also showed that they also had liked the text, especially deep intellect. It's a very cool text about an octopus living in an aquarium. I think everyone who reads it would enjoy reading it. So we created 2 items for the first passage, 8 items, both multiple choice and drag and drop for the second one, and 5 items for deep intellect. As you see, the subject matter is quite diverse. The first one focuses on social media. The second one is poverty and society. It's a social problem. And the last one is about biology and animals in the form of a story. So it's like an eclectic kind of genre. The length increases as you go from the first text to the second one and the third one, and so does the deep cohesion on the last column, which is pretty high for the first one, which probably helps students to read the text easily and to relate to it, to understand it and comprehend it easily. The second one has a lower deep cohesion, and the third one is even the lowest. Now, so in our theoretical framework, we assume that the first text would be the easiest one, the second one would be the second most difficult, and the last one would be the last most difficult text. That was what we assumed. But then it turned out not to be true, because then we did many facets Rasch measurement on the data. We included 3 facets. I don't want to go through these technicalities, just want to give you an idea here that this is how the many facets Rasch measurement is specified and formulated. So we had 3 facets, and what are they? I think I can show you better here. The first facet from the left-hand side, just after the measure, is students. Facet 1. As you can see, there are a lot of asterisks and dots. Every asterisk represents 3 people. Every dot represents one student. As you see, there is a normal distribution in the form of a bell curve, more or less, which means that students were normal distributed. That was good news for us, the first good observation. But still, we didn't have any idea if the students if this normal distribution meant that students were significantly different in terms of their ability or not. So I'll provide evidence that they were. Now, section 2, or the second facet, is actually the texts that I mentioned before. As you see, our expectations didn't come true exactly, because text 2 was the most difficult one. Text 1 was the second difficult, and text 3 was the easiest one in terms of their difficulty, which is fine. I mean, it didn't really ruin our assessment. It was just a hypothesis that we had, but it didn't work out for us. But another interesting thing was that items, as you see on the 4th or 3rd column there, after just adjacent to section, had also a range with item 10 on top of the hierarchy, which was the most difficult one, which was not surprising because it was supposedly in one of the more difficult texts. And item 11 was the easiest one, but this was a bit surprising because there were 2 adjacent test items, and this one turned out to be quite difficult. But we didn't quite easy. But we didn't have any hypotheses about the difficulty of items, because my own previous research shows that it's very, very difficult, almost impossible to be able to predict the difficulty level of items. As Gary Bach put it, we always have a theoretical or hypothetical assumption about what makes an item difficult, but in reality, there are a lot of other things that we're ignorant about, and those things we're ignorant about can also affect the difficulty of the items and give you sometimes a completely different profile of item difficulty, as you can see here. Now, I would like to share more information here just to give you an idea how the psychometric functionality of the items looked like. This is a part of the output of many facets Rasch measurement software, Facet by Dr. Mike Lineker. And those two items that I have highlighted are the most difficult and the easiest one that I just mentioned before. So if you look at the two last column on the right-hand side, infit mean square and outfit mean square, they provide us with an indication of the functionality of the items. For this kind of assessment, since our questions were like multiple choice questions, something between 0.3 and 1.7, or if you have high stakes tests, something between 0.8 and 1.2 would indicate that your test items are functioning properly. I think almost every item satisfies that expectations pretty well. So we had very good indication here that the items were most likely measuring what they were supposed to be measuring, and that's what traditionally is known as construct validity. So I'm not going to go into the idea of construct validity and all that because I think that will just be a topic for another presentation. Now, for Rasch measurement reliability, I would like to present these pieces of evidence here that clearly show that test takers were different. If you look at the separation index, that's 2.47. What that means is there were at least two levels of ability detected in the test takers. So this is an indication of the discrimination power of the test, which every test developer actually desires to have. In other words, we would like to have at least two or more than two levels of different differentiation between the test takers, and that's very obvious very evident by the high Rasch reliability of 0.86 and separation of 2.47. In the same way, the passages were also different from one another. There were at least two levels of separation. And finally, the test items were absolutely different from one another. That's also good because it shows that there was a range in the difficulty, and probably that also indicates that there was a range in the cognitive processes, the difficulty of the cognitive processes that they were measuring. Now, we also wanted to find out how students felt about this assessment system. So we developed a questionnaire. So every student who took the test was also requested to fill in the questionnaire, and we had a return rate of a good return. I don't exactly remember the rate. I'm sorry. It is just I seem to have forgotten it. But the internal consistency index was good, 0.919. That's Cronbach's alpha. And then we ran a regression analysis in which we wanted to figure out if students' perception, as measured by the questionnaire, would predict their reading scores. So we found out that yes, test score, the test takers' overall perception of the usefulness of the test significantly predicted their reading scores. What does this mean? As you see, the R square is almost 0.23, which is pretty good for this. Now, this means that this can be interpreted in different ways. One way is that if you have a positive perception about the test that you were taking, your chances of answering the questions better or scoring highly on the test is higher, at least by around 30%. Sorry, by around about 47%, because the beta value is 0.479. So that's really high, which means your attitude is very important. This probably also indicates that some of the students who didn't perform well on the test, it was not just because of their ability in reading. It was might have been that because they didn't like the test, or they didn't even like to attempt the test. That's also a possibility. But I should also add that students had and their parents had consented to participate in the study, so everything was voluntary. And then actually, in one of the sessions in which I personally was present, I saw that one or two students left because, well, they didn't like to continue to take the test, which is fine. But overall, this shows to us that if you want to administer a test to students for low stakes or mid stakes purposes, their attitude and the perception, the positivity of their perception can have an impact on their performance as well. Meaning that the test score is not a pure representation of their test performance. There are other factors coming from their affective schemata that can influence their performance. And one last thing that I would like to share with you, some of the conclusions and some of the lessons that we learned. I think this would be helpful. Developing diagnostic systems, to be honest, is challenging. I have chaired quite a few committees of test development. I have had quite a little bit of experience in test development, but this was the first experience in developing a diagnostic assessment for non-tertiary students. It was quite a challenge, but in the end, it was very rewarding because we learned a lot from this project. So some of the things that I'd suggest is, and they might not be very new to you, is that we need to think very carefully about the uses of the system, because the system, I think especially if you want to develop an online system, needs to go through maintenance. You need to work with computer technicians. You probably have to work with some companies that provide you with some service providers. Like I said before, I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but we worked with two companies. I probably didn't mention this. We worked with two companies. One of them was a local company based in Singapore, and the first company we started working with was in the U.S. The service they provided was excellent, but I think the distance and the time differences between Singapore and the U.S. was quite a big factor there. This is something that we hadn't thought about previously, and because I was the principal investigator of this research, I had thought that it wouldn't be a problem because we know the theory, we know how to develop items, we have teachers, and we have this and that. But when it comes to the actual development of the test, those practicality questions become extremely important. And yes, so we worked with those guys under those limitations and constraints. They helped us a lot, but then for the administration time, because we wanted to go to schools early in the morning, and there was a 13-hour difference between us and them in Singapore, in the U.S. So, you can imagine that we had quite a lot of issues. Sometimes the system wouldn't work, and we would just need someone like a backup person to, go through the system and resolve the problem, but we didn't have that. So we decided to move on to the Singaporean, that's the local service provider. It was much better, to be honest, because they would send their staff with us to the school, and they would go through the computers. They were familiar with the computer system of the school, and a lot of other factors together convinced us that it would be better, at least for us, to work with a local service provider rather than a wonderful service provider who has a lot of reputation but is not physically present in our context. Now, more about this. Online assessments also need security. Of course, in our context, luckily, security was not a big issue because students would do the tests in the computer labs. So that wasn't a big issue. But if you want to use online assessment systems, and this is not something new, we all know that, one of the first things that we need to take into consideration is the security, especially if it's a high-stakes test. Then security is absolutely important. I think all of us have heard, or most of us have heard about the problem that some of the universities, especially in English-speaking countries, have encountered recently due to the global pandemic. The number of overseas students applying to those universities has dwindled, primarily because most of those students who apply are from non-English speaking countries, and in order to get into the university, they have to show that they meet the requirements of English proficiency. But again, because of this global pandemic, all of the assessment systems, companies around the world seem to have closed down their testing centers. So what those universities are doing now, because that's an important source of revenue generation anyway. What those universities are doing is to start to accept some tests which are probably not secure. For example, some students can just download an app on their phones or their computers and take some simple test items and get a certificate for their English proficiency. Whereas those scores, to my understanding, I'm not going to mention any of these apps and stuff really, but I have done a little bit of background search, and I think that most of these test scores have not been validated for the purposes that they are being put to. So security being an issue because you wouldn't know who has really taken the test. Is it the student or the student plus someone else who's giving help to him or her, or some totally different person who took the test for that person? Security is important, definitely. Like I said, we need to have equipment and facilities. Luckily, in our context, Singapore, every secondary school has a well-equipped computer lab. And I think I recently heard that Singapore's government is giving away one laptop to every student, pre-tertiary student. So it doesn't seem to be really much of a big issue here in a context like Singapore. But if you're developing such a system outside of Singapore, we also need to think about students' access to computers and secure computers. Two more points is students' eagerness and positive attitude to participate in that study is also important, as my evidence of perception showed before. And finally, we definitely need good collaborations between teachers and researchers. That means that if you are developing a test for students in secondary school or primary school, it's a very good idea to collaborate with a few teachers who know the context of the schools. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge a few names here. My colleague, Dr. Chini Lo, Professor Guang Wei Hu from Hong Kong Polytechnic, Christopher Ward from Ellis of MOE of Singapore, Greendale Secondary School, and Yuhua Secondary School in Singapore. I'm very thankful to the students, to the parents who allowed the students to participate, and to the teaching staff and the principals of the schools. Appreciate their participation. And finally, to the fund provider, Ministry of Education, Academic Funding, MAF for short, which was administered through OER, or Office of Educational Research of our university, and also Dr. Abbas for the invitation. That brings me to the end of this presentation. I think I took quite a little bit of time. I don't know if you have time for discussion now. Thank you very much.